To me, you're perfect. She whispered it into the September dusk with the certainty of a woman who had already decided. And the words did not tremble the way a girl's words tremble. They settled. They stayed. They sat between them on the top rail of a mended fence like something set down carefully after a long walk. And for a long moment neither of them moved to lift it away. The wind that had been running low across the pasture all afternoon eased off the ridge and stopped, as if it too were listening. Somewhere down in the willow bottom a mourning dove called once, and then went still. Ethan Calloway was 52 years old that autumn. He had been a widower for 11 years and a rancher for 30, and he had never once considered himself a young man, not even when he had been one. His father had died when Ethan was 19, leaving him 420 acres in the shadow of the San Juan Range and a small herd of 80 head, and Ethan had spent the years since learning the land the way a man learns a language he was born speaking but never studied. He knew the way the creek behind the house rose in April and fell in August. He knew which of the cottonwoods along the northern boundary would drop their leaves first and which would hold their gold clear into November. He knew, without needing to look, when a calf was in trouble by the pitch of its mother's ball carrying down from the upper pasture. He was not a talkative man. He was not a hard man either. He was, his neighbors said, a man who did his living with his hands and let the rest of it alone. His wife Mary had died in the winter of 1877, of a fever that took her in 9 days and left the house on the ridge quieter than any place Ethan had ever known. They had been married 6 years and had no children, and after she was gone Ethan had built, with his own hands, a small wooden marker under the eastern cottonwood and had planted a line of yellow daisies around it every spring since. He did not speak of her often. He did not, in truth, speak of much at all. But every April, when the daisies came up along the eastern boundary and the light turned that particular gold that Mary had loved, something in his chest would loosen for a week and then tighten again, and he would work harder that week than in any other, and by May he would be steady again. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. Clara Whitfield was 24 years old and had been in Durango 6 months. She had come west from Missouri after her mother's death, following an aunt's invitation and a small inheritance that had not proved as small as she had feared. Her father had been gone since she was 14, killed by a horse he trusted too far, and Clara had spent the years since caring for her mother through a long illness that had thinned them both to bone and to patience. When her mother finally slipped away in the early spring of 1888, Clara had folded the black dress into the bottom of a trunk, closed the house on 6th Street, and bought a ticket as far west as the money would carry her. Colorado had been a name on a map. Durango had been a name on a ticket. The San Juan Range had been a shape she saw from the train window and mistook, at first, for a bank of low blue cloud. She was tall, and quiet in the way of a woman who has spent years listening at a sickbed. Her hair was the color of dark honey and her eyes were a steady gray, and she wore, always, the long gingham dresses and high-necked blouses her mother had sewn her before the sickness took her hands. She kept her sleeves buttoned to the wrist and her skirts to her ankles, and she moved with the kind of unhurried economy that came from years of not wanting to wake a sleeping patient. She had, her aunt said, an old soul in a young frame. She had, Clara said herself, no particular plans. She had met Ethan Calloway in April at the feed store on Main Street. She had been counting coins onto the counter with a slow deliberateness that told the storekeeper she meant to spend exactly what she had and not 1 penny more, and Ethan, waiting behind her, had seen her hesitate over the last item on her list and quietly, without speaking, laid a dollar coin down beside her small pile. She had turned to protest. He had already turned away. By the time she had thanked him he was outside, tying a sack of oats to the back of his saddle, and when she came out to insist on returning the coin he had told her, without meeting her eyes, that a person could not repay a thing that had not been given as a debt. He had said it the way a man reads whether off a sky he has watched all his life, without ceremony, as if the sentence itself were a small piece of ordinary work. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. She had not thought of it that way then. She had thought of it as a kindness from a serious man with a weathered face and hands that looked as though they had spent decades holding things heavier than dollar coins. She had asked at the boarding house who he was, and Mrs. Halloran, who ran the front parlor and knew every history within 30 miles, had told her. Calloway, widower, for 120 acres up on the ridge. A good man, a quiet one, older than he ought to be for the years he'd lived. Mrs. Halloran had said this while folding a tablecloth and had added, without looking up, that a person who noticed Ethan Calloway once tended to notice him twice, and that the second noticing was usually the one that mattered. Clara had begun, then, to notice a Tuesday. Every Tuesday, Ethan Calloway came down off the ridge to bring 6 dozen eggs and a bucket of butter to the mercantile and to sit for exactly 40 minutes on the porch of the boarding house drinking coffee Mrs. Halloran poured him for free. He did not stay for lunch. He did not talk about the ranch. He read the Durango Herald from front to back with the same steady attention he gave to a fence post, and he tipped his hat to Clara the first Tuesday she happened to be sweeping the porch, and the second Tuesday he said good morning, and the third Tuesday when she brought out a second cup of coffee without being asked. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment and then said thank you the way a man says a word he has not used in a long time. By June she was bringing him a plate of biscuits with the coffee. By July he was staying an hour instead of 40 minutes. By August, when the light on the ridge behind town began to turn from summer white to the first soft edges of autumn gold, Clara Whitfield had realized, with a small and steady certainty, that she looked forward to Tuesdays more than to any other day of the week, and that Ethan Calloway, twice her age and half her speech, had become the shape of her small, ordinary hope. She did not tell him. She was not yet a woman who told such things easily. But Mrs. Halloran, who missed nothing, had begun to hum in the kitchen on Tuesdays. And Reverend Doyle, who took his coffee 2 doors down, had begun to remark, mildly, that a certain rancher seemed to have found a reason to shave more carefully on Tuesday mornings. And Ida Merrick, who kept the post office and had known Ethan since he was a boy, had begun to say to anyone who would listen that some things a person could see plain as a wagon on a straight road, and that some people needed a good deal longer to see them than others did. Even old Silas Warren, who ran the livery at the end of Main Street and had said perhaps 4 voluntary sentences in the last decade, had been overheard telling his stable boy that Calloway's roan was standing quieter on Tuesdays than on any other day of the week, and that a horse always knew before a man did. The town chorus had begun. Ethan Calloway, alone on his ridge, had not yet heard a note of it. In late August a rider named Samuel Reeve came into Durango. He was 31, a schoolteacher out of Denver who had come south to take the position at the new stone schoolhouse on 5th Street. He was a serious young man with clean hands and a kind face, and within 2 weeks of his arrival he had asked Mrs. Halloran, quite directly, whether the tall young woman he had seen at the mercantile might be receiving callers. Mrs. Halloran, who liked Samuel Reeve well enough and loved Ethan Calloway a great deal more, had told him the truth, which was that Miss Whitfield was not currently receiving anyone, and had then, out of a fairness she felt she owed him, added that Miss Whitfield was of course free to make her own choices. Samuel Reeve had thanked her and had begun, thereafter, to walk past the boarding house on Sunday afternoons, and to tip his hat, and to say good afternoon in a voice that carried further than the distance required. Clara had been polite. She had not been encouraging. But Samuel Reeve was patient and decent, and by the second Sunday in September he had asked her, on the boarding house porch, whether she would consider walking with him to the church picnic the following Saturday. Clara had said she would think on it. She had gone inside and stood a long while at the kitchen window looking up at the ridge, and Mrs. Halloran, drying a plate at the sink beside her, had said nothing at all for a long minute and then said, softly, that a woman had every right to be sure of a thing before she went walking toward it, but she also had every right to be sure of a thing before she went walking away. That night Clara did not sleep well. She sat up past midnight in the small chair by her window with her shawl pulled tight and the lamp turned low, and she thought about Missouri, and about her mother's hands at the end, and about a $1 coin laid down on a counter in April by a man who had not waited to be thanked. She thought about how easy the world made it to walk toward a decent, uncomplicated Sunday, and how much harder it made it to wait for a difficult, complicated Tuesday. And somewhere near the small hours she understood that easy was not the same as right, and that she had not come this far west to choose a life on the grounds that it was the shorter walk. The next Tuesday Ethan came down off the ridge as he always did, and Clara brought him coffee as she always did, and for a long while neither of them spoke. He read half a page of the Herald. She swept a corner of the porch that did not need sweeping. And then he set down the paper, and he set down the cup, and he said, without looking up, that a fellow named Reeve had ridden past his east fence line the previous evening and had stopped to ask him a question. Clara had gone very still. Ethan had said, still without looking up, that Samuel Reeve had asked him, plainly, whether he intended to court Miss Whitfield or whether he did not, because if he did not, Samuel Reeve intended to, and he did not wish to walk into another man's country without knowing where the fences were. Clara had said very quietly, "And what did you tell him?" Ethan had said, "I told him I was 52 years old, and that a woman of 24 had better things to spend her Tuesdays on than an old rancher's coffee." He had looked up then. His eyes were the color of creekbed stones, dark and steady, and there was no self-pity in them, only the tired honesty of a man who had spent a long time deciding what was fair to whom. Clara had set down her broom. "I said," she told him, "you're too young for an old rancher. And I said it like a joke because I did not know how else to say it. And you laughed that Tuesday in July, do you remember? And I laughed too. But I have not stopped thinking about it, and I have not been joking for a long while now. So I will say it to you now the way a grown woman says a thing she means. You are not too old for me, Ethan Calloway. To me, you're perfect." She said it exactly like that, on the porch of the boarding house, at 9:10 on a Tuesday morning in the second week of September, with a broom in one hand and her other hand pressed flat against the top of her apron so it would not shake. Ethan Calloway did not answer. He stood up. He took his hat off. He held it in both hands the way a man holds something he does not want to drop. And then he said quietly that he needed to think and that he was not saying no, and that if he did not come down off the ridge next Tuesday she was to please not read it as an answer, because he was a slow man with things that mattered, and this mattered. He rode home in the middle of the afternoon. He did not come down the next Tuesday. He did not come down the Tuesday after that. Clara worked those 2 weeks the way people work when work is the only kindness the hours will accept. She helped Mrs. Halloran turn the mattresses in the upper rooms. She darned 3 pairs of stockings. She wrote a long letter to her aunt in Missouri and did not send it. And on the second Sunday she saw Samuel Reeve at the door of the church, and he looked at her with a face that had already read its own answer, and he did not ask about the picnic. He only tipped his hat, gently, and went in ahead of her, and Clara understood then that decent men sometimes give you the mercy of not making you say a hard sentence twice. On the second Wednesday of that quiet stretch, Ida Merrick came by the boarding house on her way from the post office with a small stack of letters and, she said, no particular reason. She sat in Mrs. Halloran's kitchen and drank a cup of tea and did not talk about Ethan Calloway for a full 10 minutes, which was in itself a kind of announcement. Then, setting down her cup, Ida said, without looking at Clara, that she had known Ethan since he was 7 years old, and that she had watched him carry his father out of the church in 1868 with a face he had never quite put back on afterward, and that she had watched him carry Mary out of the same church 9 years later, and that in all the years between then and now she had seen him look up at exactly one thing in Durango the way a man looks at a horizon he means to walk to. Ida did not name the thing. She did not need to. She only patted Clara's hand once, briskly, and said that a woman ought not to marry the version of a man other people were sure of, but that she ought, at least, to give him room to be sure of himself. Then Ida had gone, and Clara had sat at the table a long time with her hand still resting where Ida had touched it. But on the third Tuesday, before dawn, Clara Whitfield woke in her small room above the boarding house to a sound she did not at first recognize, the steady, careful hammer of a nail being driven into wood, somewhere just below her window. She rose. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. She went to the glass and looked down. Ethan Calloway was on the boarding house porch in the blue September dark, replacing the fourth step, which had been loose since June. He had brought his own lumber. He had brought his own nails. He was working by the light of a single lantern hung from the porch rail, and he was doing the work with the same steady, unhurried attention Clara had seen him give the Herald and the coffee cup and every fence post on his own land. He did not look up. He did not know she was watching. She stood at the window a long time. Then she went down. He straightened when he heard the door, and he took his hat off again, and he said, before she could speak, that a step that loose was going to hurt someone before winter, and that he had been meaning to see to it for a month. He said he had also, while he was at it, replaced 2 of the rail spindles that were splitting. He said he had brought a small crate of apples up from the ridge because his own tree had come in heavy this year, and it seemed a shame to waste them. He said all of this in the flat, careful voice of a man delivering a report he had rehearsed. And then he said softly, I have thought about it every day for 3 weeks. and I have thought about all the reasons a man my age has for saying no to a woman your age. I know every one of them. I have counted them like fence posts, and I still cannot find one that weighs as much as the reason for saying yes. A good answer is not the one that comforts a man in the dark. A good answer is the one that will still be true at noon. Clara had, later, no clear memory of what she said in answer. Only that she said something. Only that she stepped forward. Only that he set down the hammer very carefully on the top step, as if to make sure it did not fall, and then he took her hands in both of his, and his hands were rough and warm and smelled of pine sap and lantern oil and the particular clean cold of a September morning before the sun has come up, and he said, "I have not been a young man in a very long time, Clara Whitfield. But if you'll have me, I will try to be a good one." The sky over the ridge behind him was just beginning to lighten from black to the deep blue that comes half an hour before dawn, and Clara would remember, all the rest of her life, the particular way the lantern light caught the sawdust on the shoulder of his coat, and the way his hat sat on the top step where he had set it, brim up, like a small bowl waiting to catch something. She would remember, too, that she had not cried, though she had expected she might, and that the reason she had not cried was that she had already done all her crying in the 2 weeks he had not come down off the ridge, and what she felt now was not the sharp edge of feeling but the quiet middle of it, the part that does not need to raise its voice. She had said yes. She had said it once. She had not needed to say it twice. They were married in the small stone church on 5th Street on the 15th of October, before the first snow, with Mrs. Halloran and Ida Merrick and Reverend Doyle and a quiet, kind Samuel Reeve in the third pew who had come, he said, because it seemed to him a wedding was a thing a decent man attended even when it was not the one he had once imagined for himself. He had shaken Ethan's hand at the church door with a firmness that carried no bitterness at all, only a small, honest sadness, and he had said, plainly, that Miss Whitfield had chosen well, and that he hoped Mr. Calloway understood what he had been given. Ethan had said quietly that he did, that he had counted it 3 weeks running and had not stopped counting it since. Samuel Reeve had nodded once, and then he had smiled, and it was a real smile, and then he had gone. They rode up to the ridge that afternoon, Clara in the wagon beside Ethan, her trunk in the back and a small crate of yellow chrysanthemums. Mrs. Halloran had pressed on her at the last minute, for the marker under the eastern cottonwood. Clara had understood, without being told, what the flowers were for. That first night on the ridge, after the supper was cleared and the lamp was low, Ethan walked her through the house room by room, not with the pride of an owner but with the careful patience of a man showing a stranger a place he loved and hoped she might love too. And in the small back bedroom, which had been Mary's sewing room and had been closed for 11 years, he had opened the door for the first time since the winter of 1877, and Clara had seen, framed by the plain pine window, the ridge and the eastern cottonwoods and the first pale wash of stars over the San Juan Range. He had built the window himself, he said, the year they were married. He had built it east-facing on purpose, because Mary had loved the morning light. He had not, he said, opened the room since she died. He had not known, until this afternoon, what he meant to do with it. But standing here now, he thought perhaps it might be a good room for Clara to write her letters in, if she liked. Or to read. Or to simply sit, on the days when a house on a ridge felt too quiet. Clara had touched the sill with 2 fingers, and the wood was smooth from a plane worked slowly, and she had understood without asking that a man does not build a window like that in a hurry. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. On the small pine table beneath the window, Ethan had set, without saying anything about it, a plain tin cup with a single sprig of dried yarrow in it, the last of the summer's growth from the north fence line, which Mary had liked and which Clara, in the months to come, would keep replaced every week with whatever the season allowed. Yarrow in October, dried lavender through the winter, the first crocus in March, the yellow daisies in April. Neither of them ever spoke about the cup. It simply became one of the small, unannounced customs of the house, in the way that houses build their customs quietly, without vote or ceremony, out of what the people in them do not need to explain to each other. That winter was a hard one on the ridge. The snow came early and the drifts came deep, and there were 2 nights in February when Ethan did not come in from the upper pasture until well past midnight, and Clara had stood at the eastern window with the lamp lit and had learned, that winter, the particular shape of what it meant to wait for a man to come home. She had learned, too, that a woman on a ridge is not the same woman she was in a boarding house in town, and that the winter had a way of narrowing a life down to its true weights. A fire kept fed, a coat hung to dry, a pot of stew still warm at midnight for a man whose boots she could hear on the porch a full minute before the door came open. In March, a rancher named Cyrus Hollis rode up the ridge with a proposition. Hollis was a big man from Pueblo with money out of Denver, and he was, in his own careful phrasing, only trying to do what was fair. He offered Ethan $7,000 for the 420 acres and the herd. He spoke softly. He used the word fair 3 times in 5 minutes. He said it was in Ethan's best interest at his age with a young wife to think about an easier life in town. Ethan had listened. He had not interrupted. He had walked Hollis to the east fence line at the property boundary, and there, with his hand resting on the top rail of the fence, he had mended himself the first month after Mary died. He had said, quietly, that he thanked Mr. Hollis for the offer, and that he understood Mr. Hollis meant it fairly, and that the answer was no. Not this year. Not next year. Not for $7,000 nor for 70. Hollis had not risen to it. He had let a silence sit for a slow 10 count, and then he had said evenly that he'd grown up on a ridge himself up near Leadville, and that his own father had sold theirs the winter he turned 11, and it had broken something in the old man that had never come back. He said he understood better than most what he was asking a man to weigh. But he was asking anyway because that was his work, and a man ought to name his work plainly. He said he'd offer once more at $8,000, and then he'd not offer again. Ethan had considered him for a long moment, and Ethan had said, still quietly, that he respected a man who told the truth about his own father before he named a price on another man's land, and that the answer was still no, and that he was sorry for the boy Hollis had been at 11. Hollis had drawn breath as if he might say something more, and then he had looked at Ethan's hand on the fence rail, and he had let the breath out. He had said, at last, that he respected a man who knew his own mind, even when he thought that man was wrong. He had touched the brim of his hat. He had ridden back down the ridge road, and though he came by once more, in April, on a matter of a strayed steer, he did not raise the offer again. Ethan had stood at the fence a long time after Hollis was gone. When Clara came out to him with a mug of coffee, he had taken it without turning, and he had said, still looking east down the ridge road, that a man learns over time what his no is worth, and that his was worth exactly 420 acres and 1 wife and 1 grave under a cottonwood. He had said it without any drama at all. He had said it the way a man reads a fence post. Clara had put her hand over his on the top rail. The years went by the way years go by on a ridge, steadily, and marked by the light. There was a boy in the second autumn, born in the small east-facing room on a morning when the cottonwoods were just beginning to turn, and they named him Thomas after Ethan's father. There was a girl 3 years after that, born in April with the yellow daisies coming up, and they named her Mary because Clara had asked to, and Ethan had wept once, quietly, at the kitchen table and had said yes. Ethan taught Thomas the fences the way his own father had taught him, and Clara taught Mary to read in the east-facing room with the morning light coming through the window Ethan had built for another woman 30 years before, and the ridge held them all the way ridges do, indifferently and completely. A house is only a house until the second kind of love moves through it, and then it becomes something else. Not a replacement and not a forgetting, but a wider room. Ethan Calloway lived to be 79 years old. He died in the spring of 1915 in the small back bedroom, with the eastern window open and the yellow daisies just beginning to show along the boundary, and Clara sat beside the bed and held his hand, and told him, one more time, exactly what she had told him on a September morning in 1888 when she was 24 and he was 52, and neither of them had yet known what a long, quiet life together would look like. I said, she told him softly, you're too young for an old rancher. And I meant it as a joke, and you laughed. But to me, Ethan Calloway, you were always perfect. From that first Tuesday to this last one. Perfect. He had squeezed her hand. He had not been able, by then, to say very much. But he had said, in a whisper, thank you. And he had said, Mary. And Clara had understood, without needing to ask, that he meant both of them, and that he was not choosing between them, and that some houses in this world are big enough for more than one kind of love, if the people in them are patient enough to make room. He was buried under the eastern cottonwood, beside the small marker with the yellow daisies. Clara planted a second row of daisies that spring, and every spring after, until she too was buried there, 21 years later, at the age of 81, having outlived him and having, by her children's telling, spoken his name almost every day of the 21 years between. If you have been listening this long, I want you to hear a small thing plainly, because it is the only true thing I know about love, and it is the reason stories like this one keep needing to be told. The world will tell you love is a young person's business. It will tell you love is loud, and quick, and sure of itself, and that it belongs to the beautiful and the certain and the ones who arrive on time. The world is wrong about all of it. Love is not the loud thing. Love is the man who fixes your porch step in the dark at 5 in the morning because he has been up all night deciding, and this is the only answer he has words for. Love is the woman who says a hard, honest sentence out loud at 9:10 on a Tuesday morning with her hand pressed flat against her apron so it will not shake. Love is the window built east so someone else will have the morning light. Love is a name whispered at the end of a long life and understood. If you have a person like that in your life, a quiet one, an unshowy one whose worth you have perhaps been slow to name out loud, do not be slow any longer. Say it plainly. Say it while there is still a Tuesday morning to say it on. Say it the way Clara Whitfield said it. To me, you're perfect. And mean it, because Tuesdays run out, and porches get old. And the good, quiet ones do not stand at your window forever waiting to be seen. Thank you for sitting with this story tonight. Thank you for being the kind of person who listens all the way to the quiet end, and not just to the loud parts in the middle. Stories like this one only keep being told because people like you keep listening for them, and that matters more than you know. Until next time, keep riding. If this story stayed with you, stay a little longer. The next one is already waiting. A widowed sheriff in a snowbound valley, a schoolteacher who will not leave her cabin, and a single sentence spoken through a locked door that changes both their lives. Come find it. It's already up on the ridge, waiting for you.